Hi, my friends. Welcome to Inside the Minds of Authors. I'm DC Gomez, your host, and also an indie author. I'm thrilled you're joining me today for another fun interview with a passionate author. We're going to kick off this show with an exciting reading, so let's get started.
Well, I am Deborah Cox. I'm a psychologist in Springfield, Missouri, and also a writer. My most recent book is an autobiographical novel, so it's almost a memoir, and the title of it is Wife Material. It's all about growing up in a fundamentalist religious sect, which is commonly known as the Church of Christ, which is a Southern Christian denomination. So it's based largely, almost entirely on my life, on growing up. I'm going to read a little bit from a chapter kind of in the middle of the story. And this chapter is from 1987. It's based on a scene from my college experience with a best friend from childhood. So this scene takes place in the dormitory where we both lived. So we're a fictional college called Waltham University, which is based on my actual Christian college where I went, which is actually called Harding University. It's in Searcy, Arkansas. Here we go, 1987. 11:30 p.m., Abby's knock had a certain defiance to it, harder than anyone else's, yet pristine. 4 raps with her knuckles announced she was entitled to my attention no matter what or when. I jumped up to open the heavy dorm room door, worried Tamara might be roused from her snoring. Tiny black rivers of mascara streamed down Abby's face. "Can you talk?" she said. "Yeah, hold on." I would have dropped almost anything, a job interview, a final exam, anything but a date to be with her if she needed me. I grabbed my keys and left Tamara in the dark of our room in Lansing Hall, closing the door behind us carefully. "Sorry to bug you," she said, and wiped her nose with a tissue as we stood in the quiet hallway. During the family divorce process, I had moved to campus where I discovered my need for solitude. "You're not bugging me, Abs," I said, relieved. She still reached out to me for comfort, instead of going to one of her Atlanta friends. We walked down to the white stairwell at the end of my wing, and she sat on a step and buried her in her hands. Abby sobbed. I had never heard her cry in all the 12 years we'd known each other. I'd seen her shed a few quiet tears before, once when the Buffaloes lost a football game to our big rival Northern Tennessee Christian Crusaders, and the day she failed a geometry test. But this loss of composure was out of character, and it shook me. "Oh, Abs, what's going on?" Not that I needed to ask. Dating and mating, the most pressing mission of the moment, required someone else's action, a someone we had not yet identified. For me, that year felt more like regular college, with the absence of Brian and the presence of everything I'd missed because of Brian: learning theory textbook and coffee at 5 a.m., hay rides and parties where you just show up and sit by whomever, float trips with Mark and Mallory. It's not that I wasn't worried, but a bit of autonomy tasted good, like irresponsibility, like disappearing. Being single at 21, as your 4th college year slid into view, felt like skipping class and skipping church and no-showing at your retail job and wearing 2-piece swimsuits. A sweaty spot developed that year, just above Abby's left eyebrow. She constantly dabbed at it with the back of her hand. We met almost every day after chapel in the ladies' room just off the lobby of the Grover, and she corn-silked herself at the row of sinks that gleamed under fluorescent lights. She reported recent Brian sightings, and she told me about his new blonde wife, the one he brought from Michigan 3 months after our official breakup, the one he kept locked away in their married student apartment, no doubt with the new towels and can openers. "I'm glad you dumped him, Lizzie," she said. "That could be you in there." Now it was late spring, and I sat beside her on the stair. "It's official. He doesn't like me," she hiccuped, referring to Brad. Brad of the ironed jeans and straight teeth, Brad of the double major in accounting and Bible. Thick brown hair combed away from his face, muscled legs that bore his tapered torso up the sidewalk like a flambeau. How do you know? He asked Lisa Treadway out, she said, and her shoulders wilted inward and shook again. Oh no, Abby, I'm so sorry. Her world collapsed. A village made of toothpicks. I once asked her very late one Friday night in the 6th grade, what would you think if my bridesmaids wore long, flowy green pants, something like leaves? Abby said she would refuse to be in my wedding if she had to wear pants resembling foliage. Over the years, we sketched all white weddings, all red weddings, weddings with dozens of children standing up in little fairy costumes, outdoor weddings on horseback, balloon-festooned carriage ride weddings, and weddings in which dozens of white turtle doves are released into the air from great brass cages. It's not your fault, she said, as tears streamed down her face. I'm still sorry, Abby, and I had bonded over our fear of the Miss Underhill syndrome. And at this moment, neither of us had a clue how close I was to the altar, nor how our friendship was about to change. I just thought maybe this time, she said, and I thought of her last 3 crushes. If the boy liked her back, she began to disdain him. There was the other Brad, whose bald spot she pointed out in front of their entire sociology class. There was Tim. As soon as he showed interest, she called him a faggot and a weenie to his face. Then came Jeff, the young man Abby declared would be her husband. When we spoke of him privately, but ignored him to the point of disdain if he came within 10 feet of her. She dropped things on purpose when Jeff was around, notebooks, her meal ticket, her car keys. She told him to stoop down and pick them up. I think you can just bend over and get that for me, she'd say. Finally, these potential mates would stop talking to her. I used to wonder why she foiled her chances with these guys when our main goal in life was to get married. It was as if some part of her stayed livid all the time with the whole idea of Christian mate selection, as in, spiritual head my ass.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of Inside the Minds of Authors. Today, we have a really special treat for us. Not only do we have a full-fledged psychologist in the house, she is also an author. The fabulous Miss Deborah Cox is here. And this is such an exciting book. So it is definitely memoirish. So I like what you're bringing, but it's such a different look at what we're supposed to be and what we're supposed to be raised as and what really happens. So, Miss Deborah, give us a little bit of a background. Why did you decide to write this book? Because this is a huge leap. How did you decide I'm going to write a memoir based on how I was brought? Tell us about it.
Well, there's kind of a long story of me getting to the point of this book because I never thought that I would write this kind of thing. I was an academic and I was studying women's anger. I was writing about women's anger. It was interviewing women all over the place. And then I began to notice different patterns that were very familiar to me, given how I was raised to never be angry. And of course, everybody's angry about something once in a while. In listening to women tell about their anger, I started kind of journaling about my own experiences and realizing that I had a story. I had a story to tell about growing up in this particular, very conservative, very cloistered environment and what I was expected to be and how different that was from what I actually turned out to be, who I actually am on the inside. And I think hearing other women talk about that and also talking about their experiences with other women caused me to know that there was something that needed to be said. And I don't know if I really thought that other people needed to hear it as much as I felt like I needed to write it.
So when you were going through this process, because you're bringing up a lot of emotion in here, you're bringing up a lot of your own history, a lot of your own background. How long did it take you to decide to put this together, and where did you start it?
This book took me 10 years to write, which is a long time. And I know, we talk about writing. I hear you being able to put things together very quickly. You get an idea and you just go for it. Maybe you work all weekend and you get a chapter or a story written. And so this was very different, I guess, because it started out with an academic voice. It started out as more stories about anger from kind of an ethnographic point of view. This is my experience, and these are these women's experiences. I'm trying to be very academic about it. I realized there were stories that I was hearing about women kind of sabotaging each other, women competing against each other in subtle ways, particularly with regard to beauty culture. And I was realizing that too is a part of my story. So there's this whole metamorphosis in my writing where I was making drafts of this stuff that sounded very academic or like maybe self-help, and I was sending them off for critique and finding that, yes, this is good, but I have something else to say that's underneath it, and maybe coming to terms with this was not just women doing these things to each other and hating each other because we felt like we weren't as good or as beautiful or whatever, or somebody got married before us. And so we were kind of feeling like a loser. This is not just about women. This may be about a whole culture that has kind of taught us to get away from who we really are, disconnected us really from who we really are, and asked us to take on a role and to really strive to be in this role to the exclusion of our actual selves.
I like the fact that you're pointing out that we're competing with each other. One of the things that I see a lot more is our society wants us to be individual, while in reality, we're a culture very community-based and we need each other. So when you put a lot of people, a lot of females together, you have this underground current that people say like, well, women can't work well together. That's not the case. I think we're always being compared to each other to the point of having this sense of fighting. So I like the way you're looking at it. And I can understand why this book took that long when you're transitioning and you're covering so many huge themes.
Mm-hmm.
So when you decided to put it together, you actually took yourself as your subject, which I think is so brave. You know, I can put a story together about many things. Talking about me, I was like, ooh, that might take some time. Where in your story did you start the book? Was it college or was it before then?
You know, that is a great question, because what I actually did is something that I prescribe for my clients to do, because I think that writing our life stories is a way of healing. It's a really good way to process trauma, because it forces you to put words on things that maybe you have in memory, but, you know, trauma memory is stored very differently from everyday memory. So it's often hard to grab hold of the details of something. In fact, we don't have episodic memory necessarily of the most traumatic things that have happened. We have bits and pieces and a kind of a vague sense or an emotion. But when you sit down and write it, it takes some time. So what I did was I made a list of the important scenes that I could remember from my life. And they were from all over. They were from 3 years old to college to the wedding night, this whole long list of things. And then I went through and I cut the list into strips. So I cut out each scene, rolled them up, and put them in a jar, and then shook the jar up. I would, every week or every month or whatever my timeline was for each one, I would draw a new one out and write it.
You went very deep into the development of this without having any form of prejudice of what was more important. So by actually tossing them in a jar, you made them all equal.
Ooh, I never thought about it that way.
By taking them out of the context of the life and the time frame, it just became a scene. And you were able to literally create a story without making it seem like this was more important because it happened first.
No, that's true. Yeah. I just wrote the scenes. I wrote them like, here we are in 1987. I'm in my dorm room. I mean, it was literally just scene by scene. And in fact, some of the critique that I've gotten from the story is that this is a bunch of scenes. You haven't commented between scenes. You've just given us scene after scene after scene. And I suppose that's a fair critique of it.
It is also very honest. I think that's the part. A lot of the books, if you're trying to make it very memoirish, it kind of plays with each other. I think the one book that I recently read is Stephen King on writing. And he says, this is not a memoir. This is not. It's just literally, and he's picking scenes from different places. They're not in order. It's to relate his story on writing and how the writing affected his life. So it is a different way of looking at it, but it's still scenes that can stand alone. They're all individual.
They're all individual. Yeah, like literally just a minute ago, you said you're going to read from your book. And so I just opened the book and okay, here we are. Just randomly. Could have opened it anywhere. and we would have had the same kind of scene-ish experience.
It is a moment in time. It's a glance at a story. It is a glance at a moment. So when you were looking at it, you started telling us about it. This is very based on your upbringing. How did that have an impact on your writing?
That is also a really good question, because I spent the first 20 years of my life or more in a dissociative trance. Coming up with words for these things was no small deal. And I had to fictionalize to get there. I had to sort of fill in the gaps where I didn't have details. I had an emotional story. My body knew what happened, but my left hemisphere didn't have the words to say, and this happened, and then this happened, and then, because I had lived in this foggy, dissociative state for so long. And I think that growing up in a place where you're not allowed your emotions, your true emotions are off limits. And it really doesn't matter what those emotions are, unless it's just pure joy, and you can show joy, but even that you have limits on. So you're really not allowed to know yourself and to know the moment. So it is very trance-inducing. And so those memories are going to be foggy and not well put together. It took a long time, and it took a lot of playing with ideas and pieces of scene to get me to the story that is emotionally true. That's part of why I had to call it autobiographical fiction.
I love that title, by the way. It's such a complex setting, but a lot of the things most writers do, everything we write has a touch of that life, but it's still fiction. You created a very honest perspective on this playing field that you're opening up the world to you. When you started writing the story, who were you trying to address? I know you said you weren't writing for anybody but for yourself. Besides yourself, who was the audience you had in mind?
You know, the most direct audience for me is always this group of children that I grew up with. And now we're all 54. But they are with me a lot. They're in my dreams almost every night. And we all sat in the room together from the third grade, literally through college, although we sort of dispersed a little bit onto the college campus. We weren't as connected, but they've been in my head for a long time. So I think that most directly I was writing to them. I wanted them to understand my voice. I felt invisible among them. So I wanted them to see me and hear me. But then I also knew that I was writing to anybody who had grown up in the Church of Christ, anybody who found themselves with an inkling that they might need to get out. This is a risky thing to say, but I'm going to call it a cult because of how much mind control is involved in the doctrine and the teaching of the doctrine, and the ways in which people are socialized in that organization. So I wanted to say, here's my story with it. And if you recognize any of this as your story, as a part of your story, you're not alone.
I love the fact that you're mentioning as you're not alone. And I think a lot of people pick up a book to find that connection, to find that bond, and to find somebody else that their words can relate to them. You mentioned the scene, and I was very touched. It says, all of our lives, our goals was to get married. Even now today, we think of a very feminist society and every woman's independent, but in the back of our minds, how many of us truly believe that we're meant to get married? What happens when you don't do that? What happens when you don't fall? So when you're talking about it, I love the discussion with your friend and her constant fight. Yes, she's supposed to get married, and she has these suitors, and yet when they accept her, then she turns them down and destroys them.
Yes, destroys them, yes.
In a very public setting.
Yeah, she would shame them mercilessly. It was like she was sabotaging this process that she was supposed to go through.
It was a process that was imposed upon her. I don't know if she actually claimed that herself. She knew she was supposed to do it, but if she destroyed them and they went away, then it wasn't her fault.
Right. Ooh, yes.
When you were writing these stories, you're creating this world and bringing people into it. Were you looking at it from a psychologist's point of view? Because it's hard to separate your writer brain and your psychologist brain. Like, how do you mesh those two together?
Mm-hmm. And I'm always both. Don't think that I can separate them. In fact, some of the feedback I got early on when I was writing about my young life and I was in scene as a 8-year-old, for instance, people would say, this sounds too grown up for an 8-year-old to be thinking these thoughts. And I would say, I was an 8-year-old thinking those thoughts. I'm sure that another writer who's maybe not a psychologist would approach that differently, maybe even really get into this 8-year-old point of view. I think there was always a little bit of the psychologist speaking through her. I've probably always been a psychologist, and now, and we've had conversations about this, it's not that I'm burned out exactly, it's that there's so much more to do. Now I want to do all these other things. Yeah, psychology. Okay, big deal. I feel like I've done this for 54 years.
You have done this for a very long time. And by the way, you have that voice that just makes you calm down. So yes, I can understand why you're very comfortable as a psychologist, because I was like, ah, everything's going to be okay. With this book. Even when you weren't talking directly about her actions and how she was sabotaging herself, there was always those hints. You can see it through your eyes in terms of, okay, you know what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to be doing this. You're doing all these steps. And then when they said yes, we're going to crush them. So you can see it from your side through the eyes of the doctor looking in, yet still trying to be that friend.
It's so interesting because I didn't realize until just now. I would not have put those words on it. But as you're saying it, it's like, oh yeah, that's what that is. She doesn't really want to do this.
That's the first thing I thought about it, because you've mentioned it, and I spent a lot of time writing crazy characters. But she has this straight, I'm going to do it because you're making me do it. I don't want to do it. So when it happens to come to the finish line, we'll make sure that it doesn't happen. And you're going,
yeah,
that is vicious and clever all at once.
Vicious and clever, yeah.
And complying, but not really.
It's almost subliminal to me, though. It's like it's there, and people will comment, ooh, there's a lot of sexuality in here. And I'll be like, what? Where? I didn't mean to do that. But it's in there, and other people can see it, and maybe some part of me wrote it in there and didn't realize it.
The beautiful thing about writing is what you write and what we get is always going to be two different things. So even if you didn't put it in there, we're going to find something that you went, I'm pretty sure I didn't write that. But if you sigh, then go ahead.
Yeah.
So as the writer, do you recommend your books to your clients, or is that a conflict of interest? I've never had to ask this question. I'm kind of curious.
I should recommend my books. I should recommend my blog. I forget to.
Why?
Why do I forget? I think it's because I've always moved on to the next thing. And this is why marketing and building myself up, some giant platform out there and promoting myself is so hard, because I feel like I've already moved on to the 10th next book or the 100th next idea. And I'm not thinking about this blog out there or this book out there that they ought to read. Yeah.
You have a special connection with your clients, and a lot of them, I'm sure, have lived through some of the stuff that you cover. I'm switching gears. I'm talking to the doctor, not the writer. As the doctor, would it be beneficial for them to see somebody's perspective that's been there? Or is that too personal? Is that like making them know too much about you?
I don't think so personally. And here's a place where I might differ from the mainstream, because I take a more relational, cultural approach to doing therapy. I'm much more relational than a very traditional psychologist would be. And I think that we have to be really careful, because people are paying us for our time, and we don't want to make that time about ourselves as therapists. And yet, here we are a vessel, we are a presence, and they are paying us for that presence as well as that time. So in my mind, adding a little bit of that, saying we share this in common. We share this particular piece in common. So I get how it would be hard for you to imagine yourself leaving this church, or telling your family you disagree, or getting a divorce, or whatever it is that you're needing to do to grow. I can understand that because I've been there. I think that's really valuable, and I actually do that kind of thing.
It takes therapy to a very different level.
It's actually been around a long time. I mean, ever since the Psych of Women movement, if you will, came about. And I would say that this is kind of late 70s, early 80s. The psychology of women was born as a subspecialty in psychology. Out of that was born the relational cultural approach. When I was teaching at Missouri State, I had all my counseling students reading about this. But the premise of relational cultural therapy is that we thrive when we're in connection and when our connections are mutual. In other words, when power is shared between two people in an equal way, so that one person is not trying to have more power than the other by withholding their vulnerable true self. And you know what that feels like, because we've all been in relationships where we felt one down and maybe we couldn't figure out why. Why do I feel so crazy or immature or just not quite right when I'm with this person? And often it's because there's a subtle dynamic where that other person is withholding themselves from the relationship. And so you wind up feeling like the only one with the emotions here.
That is very deep and so applicable to everything in our lives. And it doesn't just apply to relationships, even at work.
Mm-hmm.
Like anybody can translate to the workplace. You have been in those situations, whether a coworker or even a supervisor, and you do feel like, okay, they're looking down at me or I'm not good enough, even if you're just as competent.
Mm-hmm.
But because of how they come across and what they put out to the universe, your feedback gets twisted within yourself. So you're judging yourself instead of going, okay, what's going on here?
Right. That very problem, which is invisible. It's like a gas or something. It's very hard to put a finger on when it's going on, and it's slippery and hard to talk about. But that was that problem of power over, of domination in an indirect way, was the very basis of this religious movement I grew up in. And so men were having that authority to take power over, and adults having that authority to have power over children. So women and children were automatically in an inferior role, in part because those authorities were using methods of relating that let them stay in the shadows so that they didn't reveal their vulnerable selves. So if you felt vulnerable, it was just you feeling vulnerable. You had a problem. You were unstable. You were sinful. You weren't quite right. And they, on the other hand, had the answers, and they were stable, and they had the power.
In the book, are you covering these themes in so much detail? Because you have me all sorts of like, those are huge things for people to think about, because you can take it outside of the church. You can put yourself in a relationship, a family, anything. And those are some of the things that our readers will get to listen to and explore in your book.
Yes, I hope that people reading it will feel themselves in it, because we've all been experiencing in some way that position of being underpowered. In fact, right now is the best time to talk about this, because as we're experiencing racial tension in a brand new way, in a way that is in everybody's face, if for just a moment, if white people can understand this experience of being underpowered, of having a non-mutual relationship where you feel crazy and you feel like there's something wrong with you all the time and you don't know why, then you can maybe relate a little bit, maybe come close to understanding the experience of a whole group of people who have been marginalized for generations and have that feeling they've been dominated. And it is a psychological experience of one down.
That is huge. And it's such a different way of looking at it, but it's also an interesting way of describing it, how just making that relationship very mutual and even given to each other can change the dynamics completely.
Absolutely.
It's such a simple thing that I'm just like, is it really that easy? It is. I'm just talking to you. I was like, oh, wow.
Yeah. And do we have the courage, do we have the courage as therapists, as bosses, as teachers, as government officials, to make ourselves human and just relax that role and go, you know what? I'm worried too. I'm seeing this stuff happen. I'm scared. I'm afraid to grow old because of what we're doing to old people, what we're doing to people of color. Well, I'm afraid of what's ahead. I'm vulnerable too in my own way.
It's interesting because as a soldier, one of the things, nobody ever said it, but was kind of ingrained in us, is you couldn't show fear. Nobody said that. Nobody ever said to a soldier, you can't be afraid. But we were taught in a very subliminal way to keep those emotions under control, like don't break under pressure. So when you see in the transitioning of the soldiers coming back to civilian life, they're having a hard time adjusting because there's all these
Oh,
emotions that we have suppressed. So
yeah.
when you're saying you got to be vulnerable and you got to say this out loud, how many people can't do that? You have an entire group of people, for whatever reason, that actually expressing that
Mm-hmm.
is not physically possible for them.
Right. Well, and another limb here to go out on is I just read Mary Trump's book and I highly recommend it. It caused me to feel so much compassion for this person who I have, multiple areas of disagreement and problem with. But to know that the only way that our president was able to, as a baby, as a toddler, as a preschooler, find any connection, any semblance of connection in his family was to be invulnerable, to be impermeable, to show no fear, to show no emotion, and in that way was able to get the approval of his father. I mean, that's the family dynamic that she's writing about. And it's very clear, when I look at the attachment dynamics of his early life, it's very clear how and why he came to be like he is now, and to not show this side of realness and vulnerability.
It's amazing because as psychologists, you tear it apart and bring it to the essence and to the core. You're going, I can see the connection of the men that you are now based on the upbringing that you had. And then you can have compassion
Yeah,
because 90% of the people are like, don't care. You should
yeah,
know better by now. So you have found compassion in the most incredible way that most people would take for granted. So I love it. You have a dynamic that you bring to the table as a writer. What advice would you give to other writers whose their literally background might not be in fiction writing? They might be in academia. How do you take that leap from writing very academic books, as you said it,
mm-hmm,
doing lots
mm-hmm,
of research in that world,
mm-hmm.
and bring it into a fiction world? What would you advise them to do?
That's a great question too. I remember reading so much academic literature and I'd have to literally chew gum, minty gum, and walk around and try to read it out loud to stay awake because it's so dry. It's so boring. It's so awful. And why is it that way? Well, what is wrong with this? Why does this feel so awful that it takes me, an hour to read a page? I'm just so bored. And it is precisely because the personal is stripped out of it. And we've been taught in academic worlds to strip out the personal because you don't want that in there. Well, thinking back about what and who influenced me the most in my training, it was always that professor who was willing to tell the personal story, whether it was a story of therapy or a story of their own lives. That's where I learned. That's where we learn from each other, from the personal. To take your academic writing and try to turn it into fiction, maybe memoir is a step in between. To write about yourself, write about how you feel as you're reading this very dry toast literature. How do you feel when your papers, you get back from the editor and they're all marked up and chewed up and you have to start over? Write about yourself and your emotion, and then we'll be able to follow you a little bit.
Perfect advice, which is very interesting because for public speaking, the first thing they tell us when we're training us is you need to have a personal story. So it is amazing. Yeah, you have to make a personal story to make a connection with your audience. So
Yes.
it is completely opposite in academia, which is trying to connect with students. Is don't be personal. And you're going,
Right.
these two things are not in line with each other.
Right. Doesn't make sense. We need the personal, and that's very much a bedrock of relational cultural therapy.
Which is the reason that is so profound and how easily you can connect.
It's really scary to do that too, and I can appreciate people who are scared. A lot of my writer friends are really scared to put their own stories out there, and so they might be trying to do it, but leaving out the most important parts. I get that. That's why 10 years went by with me trying to write lots of material, because my writer friends would say, "Where's the sex in here?" And I'd be like, "Oh my God, I can't do that." So I had to really wrestle with, how do I go to the most vulnerable places and write about that? The things that I'm most scared about. I know that my mother is going to read this and then think I'm terrible. That's the stuff that you really have to write.
It is the stuff that connects with your audience and they can understand this is real. And I've been there. You might not be in every place, but I've been there and I can understand it. I can walk this journey with you. Miss Deborah, so tell us, what are you working on now? Because our readers are curious. I am so amazed. Like historians and psychologists, every time you guys write stuff, your passion comes across in a very unique way. So what are you writing now?
Well, right now I'm back to writing about anger. I co-authored 2 books about women's anger. There was a more academic book, Women's Anger, Clinical and Developmental Perspectives, with Sally Stabb and Karen Bruckner. And that came out in 99, I think. And then in 03, we wrote The Anger Advantage, which was a more self-help book about women's anger still. I'm writing about anger again because I think in this cultural moment, it's time to take another look. And it's not women's anger that I'm writing about now. It's all of our anger. But I am writing as me. I mean, I'm not trying to be too academic about it, although there's a ton of research that we didn't have in 03 that is shoring up my argument in a way that I couldn't have back then. But I think that really cultural change is needed on a grand scale. And at the root of this cultural change is our understanding of anger. We need to understand it in a different way, in a more human way. Parents need to understand their anger in particular so that we can treat our children with respect. I blogged about this experience being 10 years old in a grocery store with my family and hearing a child being abused one aisle over, and then walking down that aisle, walking past the child who was crying and thinking to myself, we are going to pay for this someday because it's everywhere. Child maltreatment is everywhere. And a part of why it's everywhere is that adults have been misinformed about their anger. So as we've been misinformed, we have made children and animals and the planet our punching bags, our scapegoats. We have beat the crap out of more vulnerable beings. And that has led to the mess we're in today. I would go so far as to say that corporal punishment is why we're in the mess we're in today. So I'm writing about that.
Ooh, this is going to be exciting. It is interesting because you talked about corporal punishment. As a soldier, one of the things I hated the most was mass punishment. If somebody made a mistake, why does 50 of us have to do push-ups? Like, why is it the rest of us fault that somebody screwed up and didn't pick up whatever they were supposed to pick up?
Mm-hmm.
But you talked about anger in terms of parents. One of the things that we see a lot of it, and I think as an adult I can understand it, it's hard to make corrections when somebody makes a mistake. We go, it's okay. But we wait for something to build up to that point of anger. And then the reaction to the action is so out of proportion that you're taking abuse out of something. So when you say is not able to control it, is we're not addressing the behavior. We're taking out years of anger and something that they spilled the milk. Nobody died. They didn't kill anybody. But it is taking that anger completely out of context because they're not addressing it.
Yeah, that is so true. We've spent a long, months, years, our whole lifetime suppressing it. And so then oftentimes when it finally erupts, it is an eruption. It is abusive. We're out of touch with it and we overshoot. There's on the extremes, there are problems either way. Suppressing, and Gabor Mate writes about this. I highly recommend his work. One of his books is titled When the Body Says No. He speaks to trauma therapy communities now, reviews the literature on trauma and emotion and how it affects the body. His contention, based on this mountain of research that we now have, is that the autoimmune disorders come from years of suppressed anger, and that a lot of the cancers do as well.
I think Deepak Chopra calls it humans are suffering from dis-ease. And you're going, ooh, that hits home really huge.
Dis-ease, yes. And at the other end, you're suppressing anger at one end. At the other end, you're blowing it out inappropriately. It's really the same thing. Those two are the same problem. You're just looking at two sides of the coin. Anger is relational. So back to relational cultural theory, we are needing to have a relational solution. And we feel perhaps hopeless that we can do that because we've been taught that we can't.
This is going to be an awesome book. I'm looking forward to it, Madame. Just don't take 10 years. You need to speed this one a little bit.
I know. Yeah.
These are topics that we need more discussions, But we need more discussion from a compassionate point of view. Because a lot of the times you have writing that just makes you feel horrible because you're going through these things.
That's true. Yeah, and a lot of the memoir right now that's out there is political in nature. And it's a lot of blaming and it's a lot of pointing fingers at individuals as if any individual could be personally responsible for the huge mess that we're seeing.
At the end of the day, when it's talking about something that is so human in nature as anger, I want something that gives me a little bit more compassion to address mine instead of making me feel guilty for having it.
Absolutely. Yes. If you just do a Google search on parenting and anger or the angry child or anger management, any of those kind of common search terms for anger, what you're going to find is mostly essays on how unhealthy it is, how unhealthy your anger is, and how you should control it.
It's very shaming because at the end of the day, we know that it's bad. I don't need you to tell me that. I got it on my own. Tell me how I can overcome it and give me some hope that it will get better. So with your background and the way you address relationships, I'm excited for this topic because I'm like, I don't want to feel even worse because I have anger issues. That's just kind of, as a reader, I'm like, oh.
Right. And at the same time, I would even go as far as to say that it's not bad, that anger's not bad. It just is. It's just a thing.
See, we need this book sooner rather than later. No pressure whatsoever. Just letting you know.
Well, this is encouraging. Thank you. This is helpful.
We need this approach to something that is very personal to everybody and that can give you some tips without making you feel like you're going to burn in hell because you happen to explode at the milk spill.
Yes. Yeah, I'm glad you said it that way. Burning in hell.
I have other things I'm sure that I will burn in hell. Anger might not be the one I want to add to my list. But we're going to completely switch gears and we're going to do what we call the lightning round. We have been talking very, very deep, very emotional topics that I'm so happy you joined us for. So this is all about fun things about you. Don't think too much about it. Quick and fun questions. Okay. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Whatever comes to your mind. Summer or fall?
Summer.
Okay. Here's a different one. Thin crust or stuffed crust?
Thin crust.
Sweet. If you could own a private jet or a yacht, which one would you pick?
Ooh, a yacht.
You're definitely the summer water kind of girl. I can see this. Hot drinks or cold drinks?
Cold drinks.
Okay.
I surprised myself on that.
Okay. If you had to choose between being a knight or the princess, what is it?
A knight.
Okay. Nobody ever says princess. I don't even know why I keep this question. Nobody ever says princess. So here is our last one. If you could pick any animal, real or fictional, that will represent you, what would the animal be?
Now that's a hard one. So I just want to say a cat. That's sort of the first thing that's there.
Why?
Maybe I relate to them. And I like that they can just go away and be by themselves. We understand that's what they do. That's just what they do.
It's being aloof and yet part of the world at their own time.
Yes.
I live with one. Trust me. I know all about it.
Yeah, I live with 4, actually.
All right, Madame. It has been such a pleasure having you on the show. Tell us, where can our listeners find you?
Well, the best place to find me is DeborahLCox.com. That's DeborahLCox.com. And there are links there to my books, and also you'll find my blog there and other things.
Madame, do you have any closing remarks for our listeners?
I just really appreciate this chance to link all of these bits together. Thank you for the opportunity to link all these bits together because they can seem like a whole bunch of unrelated things, but at this stage in my career, what I'm doing is bringing all those loose threads and weaving them. I appreciate that. Thank you.
I'm so happy you joined us. And by the way, all your threads are coming together into a beautiful tapestry. And they're coming together probably through your works more than you can imagine. Because just you telling us about wife material and those pieces of how you brought not just your background, but the psychology behind it and telling us the story is really fun. So I can't wait for your anger book, believe it. I'm just going to keep pushing that button. And I'm so happy you joined us. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. Go ahead, give this podcast a like, share it with somebody, give us a review. Let's continue to grow this community. And thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next week with another amazing author. Bye, everyone.